by real trade war, I mean China is not going to back down. Trump has not backed down. We basically have a break in this major trade relationship between the two countries. Trump partly backed down immediately by saying these things, my iPhone, that's going to come in tariff-free because the consumers were starting to freak out and Apple was starting to freak out. You're going to break your best consumer goods, Mr. President? And he said, no, 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 we'll give an exception for this one. We'll give an exception for that one.
So you don't see that the whole tariff policy is a clever strategy to decouple from China eventually?
Well, decoupling from China, to my mind, is not a clever strategy at all because I regard U.S.-China trade as a win-win proposition. It became known as a win-lose proposition where China was winning and the United States was balance. I should not run up credit card debts. Instead, I should blame all the stores that I'm buying from. That's Donald Trump's vision of the world. It's frankly absurd to say that because the United States spends $1 trillion more per year, the one to be blamed actually is Washington in the following way. Our government is like our national credit card. The government runs a huge deficit. It's almost 7% of our GDP. It's unbelievably large. The government's running up debt. The government borrows on the markets and then transfers payments to Americans that are not coming from tax revenues, they're coming from borrowing. And then Americans, both companies and households, spend. So the American consumer is basically using that. They may not realize it, but the government's their credit card. It's our national credit card. We've run up 100% of our national income in debt. So if you as an individual run up debt equal to your 1 year's income, that's equivalent to what the United States has done. Is it manageable to pay that? Yes, but the interest costs are getting pretty steep. They're about 3% of GDP just on interest now. And I think we would do well to have good relations with China. Is that the way things are going right now? No. The United States views China as in Graham Allison's description of the Thucydides trap, as the danger of a rising power coming to claim America's crown. Of course, I don't view the world that way. I don't think there's one crown. I think there's one planet, and we ought to cooperate on it. But if you're really obsessed with the question of who's number one and who's number two, well, then China looks like a threat to you. So the United States views China as a threat. And this can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Uh, John Mearsheimer, who I regard as a really great political scientist and a very dear friend, says, yes, as China rises, conflict with the United States is inevitable. He doesn't mean violent conflict inevitable, but he says it's possible. And I said, John, but it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to say that. And he said, yes, that's right, Jeff. I said, John, and actually, Germany and France, under something called the Normandy arrangements, were supposed to be the guarantors of Minsk II, which was voted unanimously by the UN Security Council. And the United States and the Ukrainians decided to blow off Minsk II because Minsk II called for Ukraine to make a constitutional provision for autonomy of these two oblasts, Donetsk and Lugansk. And the Ukrainians didn't want to do it. And so they never did it. It was never implemented. So there's two paths right now, and I believe Trump had his word on this one, which I don't often do. But Trump says, look, either you accept the agreement that I'm putting on the table, or the U.S. walks away from this whole thing. The Europeans can do whatever they want, but Russia can continue to fight. Europe can continue to support Ukraine, but the United States is not going to be a part of this. And what the U.S. has said, apparently, we haven't seen the fine print, but it has said basically no NATO, some kind of security arrangement, though I don't know the details of it, and some territorial exchange, maybe up to the current contact line rather than the four full oblasts that, yes, it wants to join NATO. It cannot join NATO. The idea was terrible from the beginning. The United States was reckless in putting it on the table because it knew it was a Russian red line. Ukraine cannot get back all the territories that it has lost. It can't. It may want to, but it can't. And it may fight on to do it, but what will happen is it will lose more, and innocent people by the hundreds of thousands or millions will die. And the risk of nuclear escalation will remain as long as this fighting continues. So this is the reality that needs to be faced. It's the job of leaders to face such situations. If Zelensky doesn't like it or he fears for his life, he should get the heck out of there because he's the wrong person for that job, if that's the case. You know, I can only say, honestly, I have a little sympathy for jet lag. So as a nonstop traveler, but in any event, that was a sad day, that day of burying the greatest peace leader in the world.
Why were there no Israeli officials there? Because he called a priest in Gaza once a week to make sure the priest was still alive and still tending to his flock?
Because Israel made itself a pariah state in the world. That's why. Because if you are an extremist government that is slaughtering innocent people, what all of this means in summary is that we're reaching a kind of end game. Either Ukraine, to its intense displeasure of this ruling group, or not, agrees to some peace arrangement, and we know what the structure of that would be, or it would very likely face continuing military defeat. What we're seeing in Ukraine is the exercise of an extraordinarily extreme and violent nationalism, which was in the ascendancy for many years, and basically which took power in a coup in February 2014, a coup backed by the United States. In fact, a part of a long-term U.S. strategy, long-term U.S. collaboration with extreme right-wing militarized forces in Ukraine. And so what we're seeing is an extremist regime. It does not rule now by popular assent. There are no elections. This is effectively military rule. It is martial law. The population in Ukraine, as best one can guess from opinion surveys, is exhausted and wants the war to end. But the regime in power is a clique of extremists on the right that are determined to find anyone to give them the arms and the financing to impress the public into deadly service, that is, to grab people off the streets and push them to the front lines to their death. And that's what the Ukrainian regime is doing. This is an important point. So it would be a superpower too. I think we've been multipolar for a long time, and that the United States exaggerated its power for a long time. But now it's recognized that we're in a multipolar world. But what's not agreed is, what is the implication of that? Is the implication that now the great powers are going to go after each other? Is the implication that they're each going to respect their own turf, but act like bullies in their own neighborhood? Is it going to be that we'll have multipolarity and multilateralism, which is a completely different concept? Multipolarity means there are several powers. Multilateralism means that there is an international rule of law. I'm in favor of multilateralism. I work for the UN. I work with the UN. I believe in the UN. It's extremely weak. I would like to see it strengthened. To my mind, that would go a long way to making the world a safer place. So I want to move to a multipolar, multilateral world. The United States psychologically has a hard time with this. If you read Foreign Affairs magazine, as I do every issue, most of the articles in most of the issues are to reassure the readers that America still is number one. It's still, but we do not interfere by shipping weapons. I think we have to keep in mind two basic points. One is Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, and this will not be reversed in the coming months and indeed the coming years. Second, the United States under President Trump is not going to get back into the war in an active way with finance and military supplies for Ukraine. What this adds up to is that Ukraine has a real choice, and the choice is make a settlement that is not according to its wish list, but is a settlement that reflects the realities that Ukraine faces, or face further losses on the battlefield. That's effectively the choice. I don't think the United States government is going to change that fundamental choice faced by the Ukrainian government. Now, the Europeans, many of them, I should say, because Europe is divided on this question, but the UK under Starmer, France under Emmanuel Macron, Germany probably with its incoming administration of Chancellor to be Merz, are saying that Ukraine should fight on and not cede territory. But Europe doesn't really have the means to make that claim effective, because Europe plus the US was not pushing back Russia. Russia was still advancing. Now it's Russia without the US on the other side, and Europe has no means to help them. I have a high national award from Estonia. I like these countries. I'm no enemy of any of these countries. I've worked with all of them. But they are cracking down on their Russian population. They are outlawing education in the Russian language. They are cracking down on the Russian Orthodox Church. The president of Latvia literally posted, "Russia must be destroyed." He posted that. Russia delenda est, playing on Cato. You kidding? Come on. Let's be grown-ups. Let's sit down and seriously ask the question, what can we do for collective security? It's a very good question. I think there's a lot that can be done. I'm a huge fan of the OSCE, by the way, or used to be when it existed, which is very different from NATO. It's got a completely different concept. The concept is of collective security. The concept is you don't join a bloc that threatens your neighbor. So in any event, I think your question's an absolutely fair one. The Russians say things, they don't get reported. Causing this kind of instability by breaking international trade relations will lower living standards in the United States if this is maintained. It will create many problems for short-term macroeconomic management by the Fed, which the Fed has pointed out and is the reason why President Trump has been attacking the Fed vociferously in recent days. They're just doing their job, pointing out that these tariffs are going to make matters more complicated, because just in the first days of the so-called reciprocal tariffs, they were basically suspended because the financial markets began to react very dangerously not only the stock market, which fell worldwide, but the bond market, which started to fall. I tend to look at this through an economic lens. So I look at the size of the economies, at their productive capacity, and of their likely trajectory. And when I do that, I don't see China, for example, as becoming the world's hegemon, certainly not. I don't see the United States disappearing from sight. I do see India becoming much more powerful because it's going to be the most populous country in the world by a wide margin. Maybe it will be 400 or 500 million larger than China within maybe 30 years. I don't have the UN projections immediately in front of me, but it's going to go to 1.7 billion, whereas China's peaked. And China's on a trajectory to get to under 1 billion people by the end of this century. So when I do the kind of the back of the envelope calculations, China's share of world output is basically peaking about now because of the population decline that's coming. India's will rise, Africa's will rise, and Europe is going to get its act together somehow. I don't know whether it'll be now or 5 years or 10 years, but Europe is a great is a civilization, even though it's fought each other for 1,500 years ever since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But nonetheless, Europe will get its act together. So we'll be in a multipolar world, not a bipolar world. For the moment, the US and China definitely, well, it turns out it's a trade deficit that we've run for 20 years. That's not an emergency. That is a problem, but a problem that should be dealt with by the legislative branch, the Congress, and the President of the United States by law. In essence, the US is close, not far from the Russian position. Russia's saying, no, we need permanent neutrality. We need all four oblasts, and we need a security arrangement in which there aren't European troops, but are some other security arrangement. It depends what the details are. My view, my model actually for Europe in general is Austrian neutrality in 1955, where the Soviets went home. Austria declared neutrality. We won't join NATO. We won't join anything. And the Soviet Union never bothered them again. Austria became an incredibly prosperous, happy country, and to this day remains outside of NATO. I happen to like neutrality. I especially like neutrality that keeps the United States and Russia apart from each other, because I don't think superpowers should be in each other's backyards. They had broken away, and the idea that Russia was pursuing was autonomy for these regions. And that's the Minsk II agreement. And it's fascinating what the Minsk II agreement reflects. And I only understood this properly last year when I visited Bolzano in northern Italy, which is a region called South Tyrol, which is a German-speaking region of northern Italy. And it is an autonomous region in Italy, meaning that the central government of Italy does not control the governance of Bolzano. Bolzano does not pay the national taxes. It pays a kind of lump sum that's part of an autonomy agreement. And it came about because there was a German-speaking minority, an Austrian minority, that felt that it was facing discrimination by the Italians after World War II. It has a complex history, but finally it was agreed that it would be autonomous. Now, who knew about that model very well was Chancellor Merkel. She knew about it because she was very friendly. The issue, though, is the EU made a bad mistake in its modern history. It became basically the same as NATO, almost in formal legal terms. The EU-NATO relationship is not some independent, distant relationship. Being part of the EU is pretty much tantamount to being in NATO. Being in NATO is pretty much tantamount to being in the EU. And one of the saddest mistakes for the European Union is that it co-located NATO headquarters and EU headquarters in Brussels. And that's not a coincidence. They became the same thing. And that is where the problem was. We never had just a straight proposal to join the EU, never, because already in 2008, the United States was pushing relentlessly for NATO enlargement. And NATO fell into line because this is a US-led alliance. So your question, a good one, was never tested and never asked. I personally believe it's fine for Europe to have its own autonomous security and military, not to go marching off to war, but as a credible deterrence. I personally would be perfectly more than satisfied with NATO ending and the EU having its own military security. Russia's not going to obsess about that. What they're concerned about is the United States, which is a nuclear superpower. We have, along with Russia, we're the only two countries that have 1,600 actively deployed nuclear weapons. The United States has nuclear capacity and many other space technologies and so forth that Russia fears about a decapitation strike or other existential threats. Has Kaja Kallas gone to the High Representative Vice President? Has she gone to Moscow to talk to Lavrov? No. Has she invited Lavrov to Brussels to speak with her? No. Why not? That's what diplomats are supposed to do. I love diplomacy. I like talking with each other. But Putin said something in an interview in Le Figaro in 2017 that I think is really smart and interesting. He said, presidents come into office with ideas, and then men in dark suits and blue ties come and tell them reality, meaning the CIA or the U.S. security state, and the leaders. And then he says, and you never hear those ideas again. So apparently this conversation took place that Putin said, yes, I'd like to join NATO. And Clinton said, well, yes. And then he later quickly said, well, no, because he was advised by the U.S. security state, no. So the U.S. deep state, which I believe in that concept, meaning the CIA, the Pentagon, the other intelligence agencies, the NSA, the National Security Council, and the Armed Services Committees in the Congress, they have viewed Russia as either a threat or a ripe piece of fruit that's going to fall into their lap ever since 1991. They were not out for good relations with Russia. They were out to basically make Russia fall apart or regime change in Russia. Brzezinski had the idea that Russia would collapse into a kind of three-part weak confederation and so on. So